So you might be wondering, like, what exactly did Nietzsche, who used to love Wagner, now dislike so much about him? And the answer to that is that, first, Nietzsche was a big will-to-power guy. Big will-to-power guy. Yeah, he's pretty much famous for that. And Wagner, he was a big compassion and critiquing power guy. Kind of like, he wore tie-dye shirts too, he's vegetarian, he's kind of a hippie. Yeah. So that's one thing. And second, Nietzsche didn't really like Christianity. He's also kind of famous for that. And Wagner's last opera, Parsifal, it's not Christian, but it's kind of Christian. It kind of uses Christian iconography. And that was enough for Nietzsche, you know. Nietzsche wrote, I'm quoting Ecce Homo, any degree of levity, of melancholy, is better than a romantic turn to the past and desertion and accommodation with any form of Christianity whatsoever. And Parsifal was, in his view, an accommodation with Christianity. Third thing, Nietzsche became disgusted with the sacralization of art. That's Wagner's, you know, making art kind of like a quasi-religious thing. Like, you come to Bayreuth and you worship through art. And this was definitely a flip-flop for Nietzsche, who was a big art metaphysics guy in The Birth of Tragedy. You know, really changed there on that issue. He wrote frequently that Wagner was an actor, not a musician. And this one hit home because Wagner grew up as like a theater brat, you know. Didn't really receive any formal musical training until relatively late, and he struggled mightily his whole career to get some institutional affirmation for his musical gifts. So Nietzsche probably hit a sore spot, kind of an imposter syndrome sort of thing. Also, this was the exact same charge that Wagner made against Jewish musicians. He said that they were good at learning and imitating Jewish music, but they couldn't authentically produce it themselves. You just replace Jewish musicians with Wagner, and then you get, you know, he was good at learning and imitating music because he was an actor, a gifted actor, and but he wasn't an authentic musician. And that ties into Nietzsche's other attack on Wagner, and that was that Wagner was Jewish. Oh, yeah. He said that the guy who wrote Judaism music was Jewish himself. So you gotta ask yourself, you know, did Wagner care? He was doing pretty well for himself. He'd definitely taken advantage of Nietzsche. And by the end of his career, pretty famous, kind of had enough money. You know. And I think Wagner cared. He genuinely loved Nietzsche. I think so. And he would have cared about what he wrote, and he cared about him as a person, and he would have cared what Nietzsche said about him, his music. But, you know, Wagner, he also knew how to get back at Nietzsche. Wagner wrote to Nietzsche's doctor to tell him he thought Nietzsche was mentally unstable, and that this was due to excessive masturbation. And well, you can imagine how that went over for a man who literally went insane and died from what was probably congenital syphilis and never had a consummated romantic relationship. So, yeah, just kind of to close out the timeline here, wrap things up on the old Nietzsche-Wagner story. 1883, Wagner kicked the bucket. He's dead. And Nietzsche expressed some real sadness, you know. But not for long. In 1888, Nietzsche published The Case of Wagner, and this is a must-read. It's biting. It's acerbic. It's an absolute unhinged attack on Wagner, and pairs magnificently with The Birth of Tragedy. And just a year after that, 1889, Nietzsche was institutionalized, spent the last 11 years of his life in an insane asylum, more or less sending creepy love letters to Wagner's widow, Cosima Wagner, who was a real nutcase herself. Just three thoughts on Wagner. One has to wonder if all of Nietzsche's will to power and making oneself shtick, if this was a psychological counteraction to his tendency of servility and lending himself to be abused by those he admired. This pattern comes through in his relationship with his sister and with this woman he proposed to named Lou Salome, who kind of like tied him to a cart and had him carry around. And then most of all, Wagner, for whom Nietzsche, he was Nietzsche was a tremendous amount of free labor for him. Alright, second thought. This is from Brian McGee, good buddy of mine. He said, quote, perfectly possible to write about Wagner without mentioning Nietzsche, but impossible to write about Nietzsche without mentioning Wagner, end quote. True, man. And then third, this is from Alex Ross, also a good buddy of mine, pen pal. Said, quote, in the end, both men harbored impulses that look ominous from the vantage point of the post-Holocaust era. What Wagner disliked in Nietzsche, the pitilessness, the exaltation of power, and what Nietzsche disliked in Wagner, the Teutonic chauvinism and the anti-Semitism, added up to an approximation of the Nazi fascist mentality. So once the better angels of their natures are set aside, Wagner and Nietzsche, they darkly complement each other in the Nazi mind. End quote.